Hi, welcome to the second installment of Radio K. You can hear the long version of what this is all about at the beginning of part 1, but the short version is more interactive fiction games from 2002. So let's dive right in. First up, we have The Moonlit Tower by Yoon-Ha Lee. It took 4th place in the 2002 comp and won the Zizzy Award for Best Writing. The game involves exploring the tower mentioned in the title and learning about the setting of the game world, which is rooted in the mythology of several East Asian societies. Here to talk about it with me is Alex Hoffer, who I got to know on LiveJournal back in the day. It seems fitting that to discuss a game from 2002, I would bring on someone I met on the dominant social network of 2002. So, let's meet her.
My name is Alex. Currently, I'm a software tester living in California, but it's actually kind of funny because I got into my current career of software testing through IF. I started out playing when I was probably about 12 or 13. My mom worked at Yale University, and we had the Yale ISP, and there was this AppleTalk server. This is definitely back in the days. And it had maybe 20 or 30 games on it. And I think I played every single one of those games at one point, but one of those games was Curses.
That's by Graham Nelson back in 1993. It was the first Inform game and in a lot of ways kicked off the IF Renaissance.
And so that's kind of how I got into interactive fiction. I've been playing it ever since, became a beta tester for a couple of developers, and that's why I'm a QA engineer right now.
All right. So, The Moonlit Tower. First impressions?
Oh, man. So I felt a little bad because I think that this is a game that would appeal to a lot of people, and it's just not the kind of game that appeals to me. I immediately, after loading it up, noticed that the writing style is fairly flowery, might be the right word, and I know that a lot of people like that, but I tend to prefer in interactive fiction maybe a writing style that is a little bit clearer about what's actually happening. And for me, I just felt like it was very hard to understand what was actually going on. And I kind of saw the initial writing and I sort of sighed a little bit and I said to myself, oh no. So I think that sense continued throughout the rest of the game. It's very ornate. It definitely evokes a sense of place and style very well, but what it doesn't really evoke is what is actually happening, what am I supposed to do, why am I here? These are questions that were never really answered for me at any point throughout the game.
Now, this game did win the Zizzy for Best Writing, so the prose style does seem like a good place to start. Do you have an example you want to pull up?
I think that for me, perhaps the line that sort of most epitomizes the writing style of the game is when you go into the garden and it describes the compass, and I'll read the quote here. It says, "A jade compass rests at the garden's metaphysical center, between translucence and opacity, curve and line, and other dichotomies too subtle for your eye. A gentle warmth from the surface invites touch. Transactions of light show other rooms southward and westward." Okay, so I have no idea what that means. The metaphysical center of the garden, is that somehow different from the physical center of the garden? And if so, how? It is fairly confusing. I'm not even sure a compass, can I pick it up? Is it like a navigational compass? It kind of seems like it's a feature of the garden that's embedded there, in which case, how is it functioning as a compass? It's very it's very evocative, but it's also just very confusing about what is actually literally happening. And that, to me, sort of sums up the writing style of the game.
Well, I guess here's where I put on my unfrozen caveman IF critic hat. Though, I guess cavemen didn't actually wear hats, but the point is, I didn't play the Moonlit Tower with any kind of retrospect. These pieces from 2002 are the most recent interactive fiction that I've played, so I don't have any future data points to make comparisons with, but I did play most of the IF that came out between the beginning of 1997 and the end of 2001. So I do have a lot of prior data points to draw from. And when I played this, I was reminded of the 1999 Zizzy winner for Best Writing, which was a game by Dan Schmidt called For a Change. For instance, there's a comb in the Moonlit Tower that's described as easily broken by a chance hand. And there's a character in For a Change who takes with a hand and likewise provides. In For a Change, if you try to take an object that's fixed in place, it says that the object is and remains where it is. And in the Moonlit Tower, if you try to do that, it says the object already has a place in the world's reckoning. So, stylistically, the Moonlit Tower sort of felt to me like an off-brand For a Change. You know, going for the same sort of feel, but less snappy and more awkward.
The game does the same thing with when you try to walk through a wall, by the way. If you try to go in a direction where there is no exit, it will often give you some very detailed text about how you're not a bird or a shadow or something like that. And I'm thinking, like, well, you didn't implement an exits command, so I'm just trying to walk that way because I thought there was an exit. I don't think that I'm a bird. I really don't think that I'm a bird, I promise.
I have the sense that more than a few people around this time had this notion that in interactive fiction, the only thing you have to reward the player with is text. And what kind of text is rewarding? Florid text is rewarding. And the more florid, the more rewarding. It gets a lot worse than the Moonlit Tower. There's another game from 1999 called Life on Beale Street by Ian Finley, where all you do is type the number 1 or 2, and it presents you with a thick wad of purple prose. The last beams of golden sun, and the first glow of the silvery moon, and delicate filigrees of jade and shadows. Which actually is pretty close to the Moonlit Tower. Uh-oh.
The game's writing is florid and it is kind of annoying, but I do feel that it is at least sort of in service of a purpose, which it is trying to evoke this sort of mythological Eastern setting, and it does do that effectively in the sense of evoking a feeling and aesthetic, even if not in the sense of actually evoking a real place with real goals.
Yes. Goals. Or the lack thereof. So, again, I don't know how common this is nowadays, but I do know a lot of IF around the time the Moonlit Tower came out had the same basic premise it does. That premise being, you are in a place. Okay. So now what? It doesn't say who I am or what my goal is, but I appear to be in a moonlit tower. So I guess I'll go explore it. I don't know, what'd you think at the beginning?
I don't know, some parts of it even seemed like it was being slightly mean to me. Like when I looked at the dagger tassel, the response is, the silken strands are white for death. The justiciar's last resort, someone said to you once. Or did you say it? Well, I don't know. I'm the player. I just got here. I feel like the game is almost messing with me a little.
Yeah, that sort of thing is pretty typical of the you are in a place genre, though. Now, this place doesn't turn out to be very big. It's basically just 4 rooms that make a little square, and I figured that there was therefore probably something that I was supposed to do in each of those rooms, but the only thing I figured out how to do was rearrange the bones in the banquet room.
Me too. I won't say that I found this part of the writing style frustrating, but it was a bit blunt. So when I go to the banquet, it says, the banquet's travesty in its entirety gives you pause. Perhaps you could arrange it in accordance with fortune, if you but knew how. So I, as the player, really have no idea what my motivation is at this point, and the game is telling me that I'm supposed to rearrange the table somehow, but My only motivation for doing that is because the game basically told me to. And I have no idea what it means to rearrange the bones in accordance with fortune, only that if I type rearrange bones, that the game will probably read that as something that it knows how to do. But it's a very confusing experience as the player to basically be led around by the game's responses without really having any kind of idea what you're doing. In your own words, like, what is the plot of this story?
I couldn't really tell you. Like I said, I got stuck really early. I did look at the hints, and they suggested that if you examine enough scenery, you'll be given memories of flying a kite, and that's supposed to prompt you to build a kite, which I don't actually know how to do. I've never flown a kite, let alone built one. I found a walkthrough and followed the directions, and the game said you fold the paper and pierce it with the tortoiseshell teeth to create a delicate stringless kite. And I thought, huh, so a kite has staples apparently. Who knew? And, I used to say that I didn't play IF because so much of it was for people whose idea of a fun time was fixing a toaster. But here you don't even have a broken toaster to fix. You have a memory that obliquely refers to toast, and then you're supposed to just know how to take a paperclip and a bottle of aspirin and make a toaster out of those things.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the game is that it gives you a lot of tasks to do, but almost none of them are actually required. You have to go to the room with the gong in it, hit the gong, sing, enter the secret passageway that opens up, search the screens, go to the banquet room, go downstairs, and put on the mask. And that is literally all you have to do to win the game. So you don't actually have to do pretty much anything that the game prompts you to do, which is some ways good because there were many things that I could not figure out. I know that you mentioned trying to fly the kite. I didn't figure out that there was supposed to be a kite. I thought that the leaf was supposed to be a paper airplane, and I spent quite a while trying to fold it into a paper airplane and getting nowhere. But you can actually have a very, very minimal experience in this game and still win it.
Depending on what you mean by win, I guess.
Yeah, when I got to the end, I was pretty excited because there's finally some backstory right before you finish the game. It explicitly tells you a little bit about why you're here and your history. And I was like, all right, we finished the intro chapter. Like, now I know what's going on and I can play the real game. And then 2 lines later, it said you had won. I was like, what? I was expecting there to be more going on, I think, than possibly there was. But I also think that there are some aspects of how the game is structured that can definitely lead one to experiencing it like I did, and that it's possible that if it had been structured differently, I might have had a different reaction, and we can talk a bit more about that if you like.
Sure, please do.
One of the things that I thought was interesting about this game is that you really don't know what's happening. You're given puzzles and you need to just figure out that you're supposed to solve them, either because you read the author's mind or because you're responding to some pretty heavy prompting that the game is giving you. But an attribute that I feel is really valuable in games and is sort of the ideal that authors should often try to aspire to, even if it's very hard to get, is that there is a balance between the puzzle and the story such that it really shouldn't be possible to do what I did, which is to beat the game but have no idea what happened. And the author mentioned Zarf as one of her influences in writing this game.
Zarf being Andrew Plotkin, one of the big names in modern IF.
But actually, if you look at Zarf's games, I think that one thing that he's a bit known for, and I haven't played all of his games, I've only really played the easy ones, but one thing that he's known for is his ability to write games where the understanding of the puzzle is actually deeply entwined with the understanding of the plot, and that solving the puzzle means that you understand the plot. Systems Twilight is a good example of this. Probably his very, very best example of this is Spider and Web, which had that very famous puzzle about escaping the chair, in which the solution to escaping the chair requires you to understand everything that's been happening and to really get what's going on with the game. And so I think that's a very powerful and effective way to build puzzles, is to build a puzzle that is dependent on your whole understanding of the game, or effectively the puzzles are sort of checkpoints by the author, where they're trying to make sure, do you get it? You cannot proceed past this point unless you get it and you understand what I am trying to say and you understand the story I am trying to tell. And if you don't, then let's work on it until you do. And I feel like that's actually a pretty effective way of building and structuring a game. And this game had the exact opposite, where you can walk through, you can do everything correctly, and you still have no real clue what you did.
Yeah. This may not be entirely related to what you just said, but it reminds me of a game by John Ingold called All Roads that actually won the comp in 2001. And in All Roads, the story is pretty much on rails. But there is some interactivity in that there are certain optional actions that you can take, and if you do them, you get a clue as to what's going on, and if you don't, you continue on to the ending without those clues. But without those clues, the whole thing you've just played through doesn't make any sense. So all the author has really done is given you the freedom to experience a worse story.
Yeah, no, it's very related. And I think that to structure a game that way is really a mistake. You shouldn't give the player the sense that they solved and finished the game if they really didn't. And I think it's okay to have a you have one message when there's obviously a better solution. But if you're giving the player the impression that they experienced the game and they didn't, I just feel that that is objectively a design mistake.
Okay, so as noted in the first half of our double-sized premiere, I have no idea what I'm doing, which means both that these segments all end pretty abruptly and that the sound quality isn't all that it could be. And unfortunately, the next segment sounds a little muddier than the others, except for the part where it sounds tinnier. The connection wasn't all that great, and while I tried my best to clean it up, I don't think I did the greatest job. Which is ironic, because our next game is called Janitor! Ha 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 ha. Janitor is by Peter Seebach and Kevin Lynn, and won 5th place in the 2002 comp. It's set at a sort of theme park which uses a mimesis generator to let customers go on treasure hunts like in the original text adventures. Your job is to enter the game world after an adventure has been completed, and, with the help of your mimesis disruptor, set things up for the next player. Perhaps not surprisingly, this is easier said than done. Here to talk about it with me is Elizabeth Sweeney, one of the most brilliant theorists of interactive fiction in all of academia. She's currently making the last few revisions on her dissertation. I'm also proud to say that she's my best friend, dating back to the 20th century. But I will let her take over the introduction.
I am Elizabeth Sweeney, and when I was a kid, my dad was able to sort of borrow at length one of the old Apple II computers from the school where he taught and bring it home. And we had a few games to play on the giant floppy disks, including The Hobbit, which was basically a text adventure with some very primitive stationary graphics thrown in. Even though I was not good at it, I was very addicted to that Hobbit game. I found it frustrating and immersive in equal parts. And I rediscovered IF around my first year of university, I think, at which point you could freely download not only a whole bunch of older games that I'd never had a chance to play, but also a whole bunch of new ones.
Now, of those new games, or new at the time, did you ever play Zero Sum Game by Cody Sandifer?
I've heard of it, but I haven't played it.
It's a game that came out 5 years before Janitor, and it has a similar gimmick. In Zero Sum Game, you're this bratty kid who just finished like a typical fantasy adventure, and your mom tells you to go back and undo all the damage that you caused. And the running joke is that you end up causing a lot more damage in the process. And the humor is pretty coarse. It makes you murder several of your sidekicks for reasons like getting a pair and stuff like that. Janitor has a different tone, but it's still a comedy, or at least if you had to choose, is this a comedy or is it a drama, you'd put it in the comedy bucket. Or would you?
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like there were a lot of things that were not so much funny or even jokes as just being kind of droll, you know?
Yeah, there were some good parts. I think we both liked the fridge full of butter substitutes.
Yeah.
But so much of the humor is just based on picking up references. Like, hey, that's from Grim Fandango. And hey, that's from Hitchhikers.
What was that movie that we went to where everybody in the audience was laughing at the jokes not because they were funny, but because they recognized references?
Was it CSA?
Yeah, that's it. CSA. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit like that too. I think people just like to see things that they recognize, especially when they feel like they are special for recognizing the thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good observation about the historical moment of this game, when the community part of the IF community was a much bigger deal than it seems to be today. And what I mean by that is that when I was involved in the IF scene back in the late 90s, it seemed like a lot of it was a matter of a bunch of people saying, hey, we all played Adventure in Zork when we were 8 years old, and isn't it fun that we all have this shared experience and that we can amuse each other with riffs on the tropes in those old games? And I totally get the fun of bonding with people over something you all enjoyed, but it seemed to me that it was kind of limiting to put that sort of nostalgia at the center of things. I mean, to be honest, I only played a few moves in Adventure in Zork. They were a little before my time. So yeah, I didn't think that pool of prospects was going to be getting a lot bigger.
I wonder how much of that echo of old stuff is just the IF version of the same kind of intertextuality you find in a lot of literary fiction. Like, how many biblical metaphors have you come across in contemporary fiction? And I know you hate those, but they can be used pretty well. And I don't know, there are just all kinds of things besides the Bible too.
Shakespearean.
Yeah, Greek myth. But I mean, it is kind of funny that what IF has for a canon is like adventure. You know, I would never boot up adventure just for the fun of playing adventure. That's kind of a weird notion to me that anybody would do that in this day and age, or even whatever the more sophisticated contemporary version of adventure is, because I know people are still doing things that are implemented better, but that are still basically dungeon crawls where you're looking for treasure and this sort of thing.
Yeah, in one of the earlier segments, Jess Haskins mentioned that in her graduate program, they didn't play the old 70s and 80s games, but they did play the more recent stuff that riffed on those games. You know, they went straight to the postmodern pieces.
I do like postmodern stuff sometimes. I think you can do it well enough that you're riffing on old material, but also making of it something new or adding to it something new, right?
Well, I guess that brings us back to what Janitor adds to zero-sum games' concept of undoing an adventure. One thing is that Janitor is a game within a game. You know, you've got the adventure world, which is laid out according to the same sort of logic as the worlds in text adventures from 1980 or so. And then you've got the world of the Flavorplex Corporation, which is laid out like an office building. You've got hallways, lots of doors. And the interesting thing to me is that two doors that are next to each other in the office will not take you to adjacent locations in the adventure world. And I'm really interested in this idea of alternate ways of traversing space. And one reason that idea is resonant to me is that it reflects a phenomenon in real life. Like, I remember that when I lived in New York, I left my car in California, and I spent the year that I lived out there getting around on foot and on the subway, and my mental map of the city reflected that. And then, right before moving to Massachusetts, I brought my car out to New York and had it in the city for a week or two. And it was so weird getting around town like that. Like, places that felt to me like they were really far apart turned out to be just a few minutes drive from each other because they were at the far ends of parallel spokes on the subway map. Now, I know you get around using transit, but sometimes get rides. So have you ever had that experience?
There was this time where I had an appointment at a place where I normally don't go. And as the crow flies, it was not far from where I live. But because of the way the bus system is set up, there was no efficient way to get there. And I budgeted a full hour for the trip, and I still couldn't make it on time. It would have been maybe 2 hours by bus. So, yeah, I mean, that was stupid. And if I'd had a ride in a car, it would have taken maybe 10 minutes to drive there.
Yeah, the way Janitor handled geography also reminded me a little bit of one of my favorite books, which is The City and the City by China Miéville, which is about two societies sharing the same space. Some people have to get from point A to point B via point X, and others have to get from the same point A to the same point B via point Q.
And also, in addition to the adventure world having its own logic and the corporate world having its own logic, you've got the sort of added layer of if you go into the adventure world and turn your mimesis disruptor off, then all of a sudden you don't have the adventure world anymore. You have like whatever bits and pieces of junk are sort of propping up the adventure world and made to look a lot more impressive than they are when the mimesis disruptor is turned off. Like, one that I can remember specifically is the area with the bridge where if you're looking at the game world as it's meant to appear to the person playing it, for whom the janitor is cleaning up, there's like a majestic rushing river that's running under the bridge. And then if you turn the mimesis disruptor on, it's just a trickle of stale water that they've set up under there, and it's being made to appear more than it is. Or, you know, like the scenes in the house where you can look out the window and when your mimesis disruptor is switched on, you can tell that the scenery outside the window is just a painting of a field. And when it's switched off, it looks like there's a pretty meadow outside or something.
Yeah, you've actually brought up pretty much the only thing I had left to say about this game, which is that in the late 90s, there was a lot of talk in the IF world about mimesis. And I was fresh out of grad school, and so I posted a couple of fairly academic articles to the news group about all of the different things mimesis could mean. But Janitor is talking about the version of mimesis that means when you're playing, do you feel like you're talking to your sister? Or do you feel like you're experimenting with a mysterious machine? Or do you feel like you're just doing inputs and outputs with a chunk of computer code? Since, of course, that is what you actually are doing. And what struck me about the mimesis generator in this game is that, again, it does seem to correspond to something from real life, which is this. Right now, I am sitting in a small box made of some planks of wood and some sheets of drywall and a thin sheet of carpet. And all around me are all sorts of loose objects. You know, there are some books, there are some electronics and stuff like that. But it doesn't feel like I'm sitting in a big box of junk. It feels like home. Or when you're out with your friends, For most of us, if life had gone slightly differently, if you'd ended up at a different college or in a different dorm at that college, or if you'd applied for a different job, or if you'd gotten an apartment in a different neighborhood or whatever, you would be talking to a completely different bunch of people. But the people you're talking to don't feel like an arbitrary selection of humans. They feel like, yay, these are my friends. And it's interesting to feel that mimesis disruptor that you talked about turn on in real life. Like, you look through your old yearbooks and you're like, I don't remember even half of these people. Or when you're moving out of your apartment and there comes a point when you look around and it isn't home anymore. It is a box of junk. And it's annoying that you then have to pack up all the rest of this junk and move it somewhere.
Maybe the aim of being a Buddhist is to hack your brain so that your mimesis generator is turned off and you can see all of your precious treasures for the junk they truly are.
Maybe so. Anyway, we've sort of been focusing on my hobby horses for the last while now, but you're the one who's working on a doctorate in this stuff, so let's turn to that. What is the focus of your dissertation, and was Janitor at all relevant to it?
It's a really hard thing to sort of give the elevator pitch for, but the central kernel of what it's about is interactive narrative as compared to static narrative or traditional text-based narratives, print works, and how those two things differ in terms of the reader's experience. So a couple of the things that I'm most interested in zeroing in on are interface and how it is just the physical apparatus that you're manipulating in order to get to the substance of the story, right? And subjectivity in interactive works, how the reader's identity is projected into the story in an interactive fiction.
Did you have any observations about Janitor in that regard?
We're sort of deliberately given to believe that this is just a sort of blank slate character, even to the point of having no set sex. There's this Q&A, and one of the questions is, what's my gender? And the answer is, does it matter? But I guess for me that doesn't work super well. As I was playing, I sort of, by default, was envisioning the character as male. And I thought it was kind of interesting just to think about everything that plays into that. If I'm imagining that character as a guy, then why am I doing that? And there are little bits and pieces of things. The predecessor Janitor is explicitly identified as a dude. And then I also took note of the little things like the naked lady calendar in the break room and the initially dirty magazines in the janitor's supply closet, initially because you can clean them and they then become clean magazines. But I guess that did also sort of contribute to my having a mental picture of the player character as a guy, insofar as we have sort of privileged access to whatever internal monologue that character has. Like, if we're looking at the different calendar pages, we hear that each of the models was quite the looker in her day. And so I felt as if an absence of thoughts or feelings about the workplace having pinups and porn sort of strewn around kind of defaulted to male. A woman might feel any number of different ways about her new workplace, having a pinup calendar and some dirty magazines in her work closet. But I sort of do feel as if a guy would be probably much more likely to find the situation not particularly worthy of note. And I thought back to something Nick Montfort wrote about the phenomenon of blank characters in early IF works like Adventure, who implicitly might not actually be all that blank. These games were mostly written by dudes, and what they sort of conceptualized as a neutral perspective might or might not be actually neutral. On the other hand, I guess the target audience for Adventure was supposed to be the author's two girls.
And I can't resist a segue like that, so let's proceed to our final segment, which is about Till Death Makes a Monkfish Out of Me. by Mike Souza and John Ingold. This game took second place in the 2002 comp and first place in a vote among the other entrants in that competition. It's about a group of scientists in an undersea lab who develop a way to transfer their minds into the bodies of other people, including people on the surface. But when they try it out, something goes wrong. My guest for this segment is Zoe Friedland, and for those who read my website, I should specify this is not Zoe the squirrel. This is a different Zoe. This Zoe first came to my attention when I received a Google alert that someone had reviewed one of my IF pieces on her blog. So I went over there and I read it, and I thought, well, hey, that was well written and insightful. Maybe I'll have her on the show sometime. And it was only then that I read the About the Author link and discovered that she was 11 years old. And then I knew that I would definitely have to have her on the show. So, here to talk about Till Death Makes a Monkfish Out of Me is the remarkable Zoe Friedland.
Hi, I'm Zoe Friedland, and I'm currently in 7th grade. I discovered interactive fiction not that long ago, really. I was doing some research, just kind of browsing around, and I found this game, and it was so much fun, and I just played through the whole thing, and I've kind of been playing interactive fiction since.
And what was the game that got you interested in IF at the age of 11?
Varicella. The king has just died, the prince can't take power, and you are the palace minister. You're trying to become the king. You're the bad guy almost, which is uncommon in a lot of games. It was pretty dark, but definitely a great game.
So there you have it. People keep saying that we need more child-friendly IF so that kids will get interested in the medium, and clearly, I've done my part.
Yeah.
But let's move on to Till Death Makes a Monkfish Out of Me. Now, I'd completely forgotten this, but I actually first heard about this game in 2001, as it was supposed to be an entry in my spring IF competition, but the authors didn't make the deadline, and so it wound up as an entry in the fall competition in 2002. And Zoe, what year were you born?
2003.
So, I wanted to bring on guests who hadn't played these games at the time they came out, and so you're perfect for this because at the time the game came out, you were too busy not being alive yet.
Yeah.
So, with a name like Till Death Makes a Monkfish Out of Me, this game is obviously a comedy, so how well did the humor work for you? Did you think the game was funny?
It definitely evoked a few laughs at times. I really liked the wording. It was quirky, humorous, and it was really enjoyable. Like, after getting my hand electrocuted at one point, it's described as the color of your wife's baked potatoes. And a loose flooring panel depicted as like the bone protruding from a broken leg, like a wafer in an ice cream. And I liked it, but the writing style in general was a little more direct than I would prefer, but it made sense.
What do you mean by direct?
I mean, it wasn't as flowery and as descriptive as I prefer or I like to read, but the action was definitely enjoyable.
Well, if you like flowery language, have I got a recommendation for you. Go try The Moonlit Tower by Yoon-Ha Lee, and believe you me, if you're looking for flowery language, you will find it.
Okay.
Actually, it occurs to me that there is a part in this game in which the language is a little bit more oblique. What did you think of the part where you're a fish?
It was definitely my favorite part. I mean, it was confusing, but it was really enjoyable to try and figure out. The fact that I was a fish was pretty simple, but the language, the way the fish thought, it was enjoyable to read.
Now, getting back to comedy, I want to talk about the morgue scene that comes right after the prologue. You'll remember that you wake up in a morgue, surrounded by dead people, except even though everyone's in drawers with tags on their toes, your character acts like the people are just resting. You know, you look at the people and the descriptions say, oh, he must be fast asleep, and she looks positively knackered. Now, have you seen Monty Python's Dead Parrot sketch?
Yeah.
Cool. So this guy walks into a pet shop and he says, "Hey, you sold me this parrot half an hour ago and it turns out that it's dead." And then what does the shop owner do?
He's trying to convince him the parrot's just asleep and it's clearly dead, and it's just a lot of dialogue between them arguing. And I'm not sure if the seller guy knows if the parrot's dead or not. It seems like he should, but it might be part of the comedy that he doesn't, so.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. It seems to me that what's funny about the parrot sketch is that the guy who bought the parrot knows that the parrot is dead. And the guy who sold the parrot knows that the parrot is dead. They both know perfectly well what the situation is. But the seller is so dead set on not having to give the guy his money back that he is willing to say ridiculous things. Like, "Oh, it's not dead, it's just resting." "Oh, it's pining for the fjords."
Yeah.
Silly excuses like that nobody believes. The buyer doesn't believe it. The seller doesn't really believe it. The buyer knows the seller doesn't really believe it. Everybody knows that this guy is lying, but he's sticking with the lie because he doesn't want to give the guy his money back. And the thing that makes this more than just silliness is that in real life, this sort of thing happens all the time.
Yeah. Everybody knows, including Fox News, that climate change is real.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Because you're right. No informed person truly believes that climate change is a hoax. I mean, yeah, psychology is complex and people can do all sorts of Orwellian doublethink tricks on themselves. And, of course, there's something to be said for the notion that people won't let themselves understand things when their salaries depend on them not understanding those things. But I'm enough of a rationalist to think that underneath all of the denial, people know the deal. When oil company executives testify in Senate hearings that it's snowing in Boston, so the planet can't possibly be getting warmer, deep down, they don't actually believe what they're saying, and the senators know they don't believe it. But they all know that no matter how specious their argument is, as long as they're shameless enough about it, they can get enough people to rally around it that they won't have to change their business model. But I'm getting a little off track here. The point is, this is not what's happening in the Monkfish game. It's not satirizing real human behavior. Now, you could imagine a version that did. Like, if we had clues that your character did initially recognize that he was in a morgue, and then started acting like everyone was just taking a nap, what would that tell us?
He's refusing to believe that he's dead, and so he's coming up with all these explanations. They're just asleep because he just doesn't want to face the fact that, he's dead.
I think that's exactly right. And if the game had gone about it that way, then it would have been a satire of the way that we deny that we're mortal. And that would be a little more sophisticated. As it is, it seems to me like the game is just trying to get laughs out of, "Oh, haha, this guy is dumb." And to me, that sort of thing is generally not as funny.
I agree, yeah.
Now, a lot of comedy games are a little easier than average, partly because when you write jokes, you want players to actually get to them, and also because you want players to be in a good mood as they're playing, because if they're feeling frustrated because they're stuck on a puzzle, they might not be in the mood to laugh much. But this one was pretty puzzly. Personally, after I got about halfway through, I wound up going to a transcript that I found online and mostly just following that. So how about you? Did you get any help, or did you go through the whole game on your own?
Took me a while, but I went through it.
Wow. You are clearly much better at these things than I am. Did you use the game's built-in hint system at all?
There was this one point where I wasn't making any progress, and I tried to go back onto the hint system. And the frustrating thing was the hint system is location-based, and I could see how this could be helpful, but the location-based tries to give you hints based on where you are, so you can get the hints on what you're doing. except I was in the wrong location for solving this puzzle. And so it kept giving me these hints for something completely different.
Where did you get stuck? Not necessarily the exact spot in the game, but what sorts of things about the game tended to give you a harder time?
As I said before, the writing was pretty direct, so I kind of skimmed through it, just catching on to main words. And I did this in the beginning of the game, and it was a huge mistake for me because the game tends to point out certain objects as it describes your scene. So it would, in a new paragraph, just write one sentence describing that there's a shelf around you or whatever object is around you. And this was helpful sometimes, but the problem was I started reading it really quickly just to get to the main objects. And I would miss stuff that they hadn't pointed out, but that were actually really important to the game. So, I would find myself much later after getting stuck, going way back and reading through and then finding this thing I had totally missed and be like, oh, why didn't I see this? So it was kind of confusing at first because I was expecting everything that was important to be pointed out so directly, like some of the things were. And the fact that this was inconsistent was kind of confusing.
Now, on the flip side, were there any puzzles that you particularly liked?
There was one puzzle where it was probably the hardest puzzle, but really quite clever, actually. I won't go into too much detail because spoilers, but you're trying to find the password, which has been translated into a different language called Proto-French. So immediately I got to type chien into the computer because that's dog in French. And it was really frustrating when it didn't work. I realized Proto-French is not an actual language, which would make sense, or else, you could just translate. It took a while, but the actual solution was really quite clever, although probably the hardest puzzle in the game.
Now, one thing that's come up in the previous segments of this show is the extent to which the puzzles in a game are integrated with the plot. Like, Savoir-Faire is about a world in which there's a magic system called the Lavore d'Arachne, and most of what you do in the game is figure out different ways to use this magic. In Another Earth, Another Sky, you play a character with super strength, and while not every puzzle is about using your super strength, a lot of them are. Now, the Monkfish game has this really clever plot about body switching. But did you find that the puzzles were really related to that?
I feel like a lot of the puzzles I was solving was just figuring out how to open doors and get past hallways. There were some pretty good ones there, but at some points it seemed like they had almost made the puzzles without really considering how those puzzles were going to help me understand what was going on. Most of the information on body switching was at the very beginning and during the little bit of dialogue at the end, which I have to say was pretty confusing.
Now, once you finish the game, you get a chance to read some of the emails between the two authors when they were developing the game. And those emails suggest that there was supposed to be a unifying theme, which was that instead of trying to stay alive, like in most games, you're actually trying to get yourself killed, so that you will switch back to your proper body. That's why the game is called Till Death Makes a Monkfish Out of Me. But that didn't really land for me. There were long stretches when I completely forgot that I was supposed to be trying to get myself killed. I was just trying to get into the next room and the one after that. So, when you were playing, did you think that getting your character killed was your main goal?
It was definitely a goal, but it didn't seem like the main goal of the game. There were definitely times when the feedback suggested that if I killed myself, I would be in the right body. For example, when I tried to electrocute myself, that was definitely an intent. Now that I think about it, it definitely makes sense that it could be the main goal, but to me, the main goal was to figure out what I was doing there, why I was in the wrong body, and somehow switch myself back, because to me it seemed like the idea of killing myself was just a theory and it didn't seem like it was actually going to work. I thought it was just another desperate attempt of the character I was playing to figure out what was going on.
All right, well, we're coming to the end of our time, so to wrap things up, what did you think of the game overall?
Overall, I really enjoyed the game. There were just a few things that kind of got to me. There were quite a few spelling and grammar mistakes. It's kind of scattered throughout. For example, something was described as being far too heavy, except the two only had one O, or I was on the trolley. And this wasn't really a huge deal. I just wanted to point out because it's pretty unusual for me, at least, to find so many spelling and grammar mistakes in such a well-made game.
Yeah, I noticed that too. That was an issue with John Ingold's previous game as well. And the IF world is pretty small, and I've met John Ingold once or twice. He's a great guy, full of absolutely brilliant ideas, does not know how semicolons work.
I can agree.
Or at least the 2002 version of him didn't. Like, here's a line early on in this game. You'd consider asking her out, semicolon, just to irritate your wife. That's not how semicolons work.
No.
There was another mistake that gave me a laugh. There's a point at which you're described as having a nervous tic. Now, that's fine, except tic was spelled T-I-C-K. A nervous T-I-C is a facial twitch. A nervous T-I-C-K is an apprehensive arachnid. Now, don't get me wrong. Everybody makes typos. There are times I've been working on a chapter and have gone back over it for literally the 50th time and have still found typos. But in IF, this can be a real problem. Do you remember the part about the bomb?
Mm-hmm.
Did you try to blow up the bomb?
Yeah.
How many times?
Basically, I was constantly hitting the button and getting the same response. I would press it whenever, I moved around, even if it was just a little bit. At the beginning, I was walking to all these different places in the room, and I couldn't figure out what personnel was. That was a little confusing.
And the reason it was confusing was that the message said personal within blast radius, and it was supposed to say personnel. And again, everyone makes typos, but for a message that you might see a dozen times that's supposed to be a key clue, it's kind of important that it makes sense. I mean, if the player doesn't know the word personnel, that's fine. That's what dictionaries are for. But looking up the word personal in the dictionary doesn't help. But again, I don't want to make too big a deal out of this. It couldn't have been that big an issue because you did finish the game.
Yes, but the end was pretty confusing, and it wasn't that satisfying because the ending didn't really give much of a resolution. You have all this stuff and it's all building up to something, and then there's nothing. It just kind of dropped me off a cliff, except I only fell 2 feet and hit the concrete, and that was it.
Well, I can't think of a better way to wrap it up than that. And that also wraps it up for the debut of Radio K. Many thanks to my guests, Claire Parker, Jess Haskins, Alex Hoffer, Elizabeth Sweeney, and Zoe Friedland. And also to the game authors, Emily Short, Paul O'Brien, Yoon-Ha Lee, Peter Seebach, Kevin Lin, Mike Souza, and John Ingold. The music is by Eric Berg and Riku Nwatiarvi. I don't know how frequently future installments of Radio K are going to be coming out, but as I said at the end of part 1, I will need guests for them. So, if you meet the criteria and you think you might have any interest in coming on the show, just go to adamkadri.ac and click on the stamp. Thanks for listening to this little journey back to 2002, and I hope we can follow the lead of Nina Gordon and meet again in 2003. Till then.